are listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hello, my name is Uwe Schulte, and it's a pleasure to welcome you back after our holiday break for this new episode of our podcast series, Let's Talk Sustainable Business. The series is brought to you by the Conference Board Global Sustainability Center. Today, I will be talking to Kwon Ping Ho, the Executive Chairman of Banyan Tree Holding. Before we get started, let me please make a short remark. Whilst recording this episode, the COVID-19 pandemic is still very much present. Our whole podcast team would like to express our support for all those suffering in this crisis and voice our gratitude to the many who continuously are supporting people in need in this crisis. So first, let me introduce our guest to you. Kwon Ping Ho is the Executive Chairman of Banyan Tree Holding. He graduated from the National University in Singapore in economics and history. He started his career as a journalist in the late 70s. Later, Kwon Ping joined the family business in the 90s and opened his first Banyan Tree resort in Phuket in 1994. He serves as director on several boards, and he featured on the cover of Fortune International. Welcome, Kwon Ping.
Thank you.
Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your personal sustainability journey. How did you actually embrace sustainability?
Well, in actual fact, when I first went down this journey, there really weren't words like corporate social responsibility, sustainability, or much else along those lines. And this was back in the 70s. I suppose the very origins would have been the fact that I was always a student of development economics, and economic development issues were always top of mind for me in everything that I did, rather than business or journalism. So when we accidentally fell into, almost literally fell into an abandoned tin mine in Phuket, and on a whim, we bought it because it was so cheap, and not having studied business, I never heard of the words due diligence and so on. And we bought this tin mine because it looked like a moonscape, a very eerie, surrealistic moonscape with no trees, just sand dunes um, at an oceanside location. And we bought it, and so I thought we would do something with it. And my brother was an architect, so I started researching, as a good journalist would do. And along the research came discoveries that the reason why the land was so cheap and why it looked like a moonscape was because it had been totally depleted of any minerals, because it was used as any sustainable regenerative minerals and soils, because it was a totally ripped out tin mine. In the course of trying to rehabilitate that piece of land, we began to experientially learn what you could do in terms of doing good by rehabilitating depleted areas. And also we began to realize how you can really destroy the environment around you very carelessly. So that first encounter with both the two sides, I would call it, of tourism, gave us a head start to realizing that we could do so much good and we could do so much damage. And we've never looked back from 25 years ago.
I understand, and that's quite an impressive experience, I guess. I can visualize it before my eyes what it probably had looked like, and people can go on the internet and look what it looks like now. So that's impressive. But we have a global audience, and there might be some listeners who don't know a banyan tree. Can you briefly talk about the history and the scope of your business today?
Well, we never intended um, to develop a hotel management company. It's partly by accident and partly by intent. The intent was to actually build a brand, because when I joined our family business, it was not at all in Banyan Tree. It was into many other areas of business which my father had started. And they were all in contract manufacturing, they were in trading, they were in so many different things that Southeast Asian entrepreneurs would do, but we never really owned the brand. We were generally cheaper producers of goods for other people. So I had wanted to establish a brand. but I didn't know what it was. And partly by luck, it's a very long story, but by luck, we decided to start a hotel management company. Largely because the last piece of land we had at Laguna Phuket, which we wanted to develop as a hotel, no hotel management company wanted to actually manage it because it didn't have a beachfront at all. So being young, again, being ignorant and stupid, and we decided that that would be the starting point of starting our own brand. And as a result of that, 25 years later, we've got about 50 over hotels. We've got 6 brands. The last few brands we just added 2 or 3 years ago, and we're growing moderately fast. Probably will double the number of hotels we'll have within the next few years because of the very fast growth of Asian tourism.
Yeah, so I must say, I I don't have the knowledge about sustainable tourism, and I guess a number of our listeners will suffer the same ignorance. Can you describe from your perspective what you would call sustainable tourism?
Well, in fact, the interesting thing now is the new term is not just sustainable tourism, it's regenerative tourism. And that's an area we're actually looking very interestingly at. Because the word sustainable tourism means you just do no further damage
Mhm.
to the environment, you just sustain it. But very often, when you sustain it at the same level as what you have currently, it's not necessarily regenerative. So that's an actually interesting aspect that we're just beginning to realize that one can actually go beyond sustainability to regeneration. But taking the point, let's say sustainable tourism, I guess the fundamental idea is that tourism, because of mass tourism and other effects of tourism over the last many years, you're actually destroying both the physical and the human environment. It's very simple to look at because mainly because we're involved in a lot of developing countries, from China to Asia Pacific and to Mexico to Seychelles to Morocco. So we're in so many places where we are in very beautiful, pristine areas, and generally tourism comes in and destroys the environment. At the same time, they also destroy communities. When you look at the economic disparity between rich tourists and poor communities who service the rich tourists, you've also got social contradictions that are not sustainable. So, our slogan for our version of sustainability is to empower people and embrace the environment. We take a holistic view that sustainable tourism is not just about physical rehabilitation of the physical environment. It has to be a socio-economic, social-cultural compatibility between the tourism that comes in from outside and the local community also.
I understand that regenerative. We come back to again. I think that's a very important point. But you've just explained environmental and social aspects going hand in hand. Can you give us an example of one of your projects to explain that in a little bit more detail, how you apply these principles in practice?
Well, yes. I mean, they're in so many places, whether they're in Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Seychelles. I mean, more than half of the places where we're at, we usually pioneered the resort locations there. And the physical part then is quite simple. Usually, you come into a very beautiful, pristine area. Now, if you're not very careful about the way you design your project and the way you build it, you can destroy the natural terrain. The construction process can actually lead to such severe erosion that pristine beaches with soil overflow, beautiful coral reefs, and all that will be destroyed. So, in the very physical process of building a beautiful resort, you're actually already destroying the physical environment, and that's happened so many times over. It's shameful to look at the track record of tourism developers there. That's on the physical side. And so therefore, when we come in, we're very, very careful about how we plan and design our resorts. We have our architects and stay, days on end at the physical location to make sure that we really understand the terrain. We make sure that we tie white ribbons around all the big trees so the contractors will not just come in and raise them. So from that side, we've got it down pat. We make sure that in terms of infrastructure, we try to be as carbon light as we can. Those are all on the physical side of it. Everything we do has to be certified by EarthCheck, which is one of the two largest accreditation agencies regarding the way you build and operate buildings. On the social side, that's a bit more complicated because very often you find that in the local community, the tourism investor generally is the only source of economic development. So they're welcomed. On the other hand, the economic disparity, the income disparity between the people who work at the resorts and the people who come and play at the resorts is so huge that one day's room rate, which a European tourist would think nothing of, could equal close to a month's salary for a frontline worker. So if you then do not mitigate the relationship between the tourist and the frontline worker, you then end up with a situation of server who feels a certain servitude towards the guest, who feels a sense of superiority. You then develop a semi-colonial relationship, which I, as an Asian and an ex victim of colonialism, would resent very, very much. So one of the bigger things we have to develop that has been more of a challenge for us is to create a true service culture where that service comes from the heart and is not because the server is a poorer person from a third world country who is obliged to serve the rich European tourist. Thankfully, because of the last 10 to 15 years, the rise in the Asian middle class has been so rapid. We're no longer seeing this great economic and quasi-racial disparity. So that has been a big challenge for us in Banyan Tree to create a real sense of pride and self-respect and a genuine sense of wanting to serve other people. And that is at the heart of sustainable tourism also.
That's very interesting. The point you're making about the social aspects of this is, of course, you come in and with such a large resort, you change the social relationships in that community as well. Um, how do you evaluate your impact there?
We have seen you if you want to be accepted by the community, not only do you provide economic livelihood for the people who live around there, but you try to respect their culture. That's another aspect of what we try to do. So we have my wife started Banyan Tree Gallery, and it's basically Banyan Tree Gallery is essentially a retail arts and crafts center within all our resorts where we source both products that we sell to guests as well as products that we put into the hotel. We try to source them from the local community. We also try to feature artworks as much as possible from the local community. We try to create a sense of place. So all of this is becoming now known as sustainable tourism. And we never knew the fancy word sustainable tourism. We backed into it, I suppose, by simply doing. And the background of my wife as a development sociologist and myself as a development economist, I guess, helped us because we had the perspective within which we could view our efforts to build a hotel management company. We were not professional hoteliers, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, that's a very interesting remark. That fresh eyes can start things in a different way and possibly in an even better way. And let's get back to the regenerative aspect of what you were talking about. I find that extremely interesting because we're talking about, in sustainable language, probably about positive impact here.
Mhm.
Um, so, can you explain a little bit where you see chances to do more than just maintaining the environment and the social situation?
Well, I mean, one early aspect of regenerative tourism has been planting trees. We've got so many trees planted, and we have a program whereby we donate $1 for every dollar that is donated by our guests, and that goes into the Banyan Tree Global Foundation and a program called the Green Imperative, where we then essentially try to look at areas that have not that areas of a society that have degenerated. So it could mean reforesting areas, restoring coral reefs, restoring lost arts and crafts. So if you really, if you go into a resort area with the eyes of a development economist and development sociologist rather than as a hotelier, and you then ask yourself the question, what has been depleted and degenerated from this entire community over many years? Then you basically can analyze it systematically and say, on the physical side, this is what has happened. The water table has dropped. They've been practicing monoculture in their agriculture. X, Y, Z. You can list out all these things. You look at the social aspect of what's been happening also, um, and so on. And then you can craft your own policies within the hotels so that you constantly try your best to restore and regenerate those lost things. So, for example, a lot of properties now, including ourselves, a lot of resort developers have thousands of acres of undeveloped land, which they bought because it's usually not that expensive, land that is not near a beach or something. And many people now are beginning to practice farm to table agriculture. We are doing that in our resorts now, where we have so much land. We actually teamed up with farmers and with chefs too to actually grow exotic vegetables, which would have had to be otherwise imported. So we save on carbon footprint and so on by growing locally vegetables that usually have to be imported and are quite expensive. We also grow other kinds of local crops, which have been too much subjected to monoculture before and depletes the nitrogen in the soil. We then take all these vegetables and we use them in our own restaurants. So that's just one example. So there's many, many areas of tourism where you can consciously practice regenerative tourism, which goes beyond simply sustainable tourism.
I understand. Now, let's get to the more tricky bits of this. You know, it is great that tourism can help in the developing world to elevate people out of poverty, and that can't be underestimated at all. But at the same time, this requires, of course, people from the developed world to travel there, and that's usually by plane, I guess, and that has a carbon footprint.
Mm.
That's a dilemma. How do you see the resolution of such a dilemma?
I think that goes to the heart of what economics is all about. Economics is all about trade-offs and trying to optimize the trade-offs. I think only the very naive idealists in the world would think that you can do everything for good and that there's no trade-off involved. There's obviously going to be trade-off, as you have just mentioned. I can mention trade. I can also mention travel. As you've just mentioned, some radical environmentalists are now saying everyone should just stop traveling on anything that involves um, carbon footprinting. They shouldn't even take trains, shouldn't take cars. Maybe if it's electric cars, it's okay, but they should only go to holidays where they can bicycle to within a short distance of their homes. That's fine and good if you are living in a developed country. But until poor developing countries can themselves become developed, that simply is going to mean that the inbound tourism from rich countries cannot be a source of economic development. That's one example of how there's no easy solution, because we do know, and I think we all accept that aircraft emissions are also very negative, and the airline industry has to find its own way to reduce its carbon footprint. But until that is done, if everybody just simply stopped taking planes, that might ease the conscience of some people in the Western world, but it's going to cause also a lot of people economic distress in the developing world. You take trade. There was a recent article that because of COVID-19, the flower industry in the Kenyan highlands have been totally destroyed. Kenya, of course, being relatively near the same time zone as Europe, and also having a higher altitude, near Nairobi and so on, has been exporting a lot of flowers to Europe.
Yeah.
That's completely died. Now, that particular case was because of COVID-19. But if people basically took the argument that we should do everything that's necessary to simply reduce the carbon footprint in whatever we do, that is going to lead to less carbon footprints, no doubt. But the dilemma there is that it will also lead to one-sided economic development. So there is no easy answer. And I think the whole science of economics is to really look at the different trade-offs and to very, very minutely, very analytically, and dispassionately trying to find a middle way solution for whatever we do so that the trade-offs, and they will inevitably be trade-offs, the trade-offs can have the least negative impact on all parties involved.
I understand what you're saying, and the Kenyan, excuse me, the Kenyan example is quite a strong one. I see the effects as well, and we have to think about making also sure in these developments that we don't become focused just on one thing. So having several legs to stand on for each country when they do their development is so very much important. Now, people might say when they listen to your excellent efforts that you are in a niche of very luxury resorts and you have affluent guests. So it might be easy, I don't think it is, but it might be easier, let's say, to follow sustainable concepts or regenerative concepts. But I guess there are learnings from what you have done which could be applied to the mass tourism segments as well. How do you see that?
Well, that's a very interesting point because Banyan Tree, the first and most well-known brand of our six brand platform, is inevitably associated with luxury tourism and so on. But I've never been a great fan of luxury. We got into luxury simply because it was an area that was most underserved at that time because each so-called luxury boutique hotel would generate the least management fees. So big hotel management companies were less interested in managing a 50-key luxury hotel than a 500-key mid-scale hotel. So there was a space there. We wanted to play in that space. We got into it. And that's also why we've survived for so long. But as I've just mentioned to you, in the last 20 years, the most exciting thing from my point of view has been what I call the rise of rainbow tourism. Rainbow tourism meaning is a tourism of many different colors, whereas in the past, tourism was always unidirectional and single color. It was white tourism going from Europe to the rest of the world. Now, in the last 15, 20 years, you've got brown, black, and pink tourism, very much so, all around the world now. Asia is rising, and India is rising, China is rising, and so this Middle East is rising. So you're getting very multicolored tourism. And as a result of that, the demand for hotels in the Asia Pacific region is not just for luxury hotels to serve rich tourists coming in from Europe, it's to serve their own young middle classes. That we are very much involved in that. The last 3 or 4 brands that we have launched, and they're growing very rapidly in China and elsewhere, is to serve that younger, more affordable mass market. And in some ways, if you look at it even from the perspective of regenerative or sustainable tourism, it's more exciting than even luxury tourism, precisely for the same reason that you mentioned. It's great to have a little resort charging $5,000 a night in the Maldives that's practicing zero carbon footprint kind of tourism. But does it really move the needle in any way at all? And it just, in my view, is just a situation of that kind of resort is largely for millionaire celebrities to come and assuage themselves of their guilt, and they feel great about what they've done, but it doesn't move the needle. If I can, through what we're doing now with our mass tourism projects, if those can have regenerative aspects to them and have sustainable aspects to them, then they will have a far bigger impact than having sustainability and regeneration only in luxury resorts. So to me, this is a huge challenge, a huge opportunity at the same time.
Have you got already some ideas in practice how that because you can't simply apply what you've done in luxury resorts. So
No, but in the same way, you see, I suppose if you were to look at it from one perspective, mass tourism is not a bad thing. Tourism has almost become somewhere along the the line of the hierarchy of needs beyond basic needs. Most people, after a certain economic level, want to see the rest of the world around them, and it's something they desire to do. And we want to feed that basic desire for people to see the beauty of the world around them. I think we can do it with mass tourism. I'll just give you one example. If the kinds of farm to table practice that we want to do in agriculture can be replicated for a 400-room hotel, it has bigger impact than if you're just doing for a 50-key hotel. If you can save water or generate your own water, and so on and so forth. If you want to have no more single-use plastic, if you want to practice using only bioplastics. So whatever practices you want to implement that are going to be regenerative or sustainable, you can practice it across a very much bigger platform if you're engaged in mass tourism. That's why it's very important that the people who are involved in mass tourism, like the Accors, the Marriott hotels of the world, it's very important that they adopt these practices because they have far bigger impact in many ways than a Banyan Tree hotel would have.
Yeah, and I think we see these tendencies, and that's very encouraging. Unfortunately, it's great to listen to what you have done and what you're doing. The time of this podcast is already flown by, and I would like to thank you very much for these very interesting aspects about regenerative tourism. In our next episode, I would like to continue our conversation and widen the perspective and looking at the future of corporate sustainability in Asia. I'm looking forward to talk to you then about that.
Surely.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kwon Ping. And for our listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast series or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. You can also write to us at sustainability@tcb.org and give us suggestions and feedback about the podcast. Thank you for listening, and join us for our next episode in 2 weeks' time. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.